The Young and the Restless spoilers. The truth about Claire Newman began as a whisper, something that moved beneath the surface of happiness, unseen, but powerful enough to shatter lives when it finally emerged. For weeks, Genoa City had watched her radiate warmth and serenity beside Holden Sienna and the man once known as Matt. She laughed easily, spoke softly and carried herself with the confidence of someone untouched by the shadows that haunted everyone else. But that peace was an illusion, a carefully woven curtain hiding a truth so dark that even the ones who claimed to love her would recoil when it was finally drawn back. Claire seemed unaware, or perhaps indifferent to the growing unease around her. She had everything she wanted: companionship, attention, the illusion of belonging. Holden admired her calm. Sienna envied her poise. And Matt, ever the manipulator, seemed fascinated by the depth of her charm. She gave little of herself away, just enough to keep them orbiting her beneath the laughter, though something colder stirred a precision in her gaze, a deliberate control of her surroundings that hinted at calculation rather than innocence. Victoria, however, was not fooled. A mother's instinct is not so easily silenced, even when reason demands it. Though she had long believed Claire was her daughter, she had begun to sense something incongruous, a faint but persistent dissonance in the details of the girl's past. There were inconsistencies, documents that didn't align, memories that felt rehearsed, reactions that didn't belong to someone who shared her blood. At first, Victoria dismissed them as paranoia, remnants of grief and guilt. But then came the letter from Cole. It had arrived unexpectedly, its seal unbroken for months, buried beneath old correspondence and unopened packages. When she finally opened it, the handwriting, the same calm, elegant script she had once known by heart, nearly stopped her breathing. It wasn't a love letter, it was a will. Cole, in his last act of clarity, had left behind instructions, not for property or wealth, but for truth. In the letter, he wrote of a child he had known, a girl whose origins were not as they appeared. He wrote of deception, of a web spun by someone desperate to belong, someone who had crafted a new life by erasing the one before it. The child Victoria believed she had lost had been taken, replaced by another, someone molded, trained and set loose with a new name and a false story that someone was Claire. The revelation unfolded in stark, merciless detail. Cole's words described the shift he had seen in her over the years, how innocence had hardened into manipulation, how affection had curdled into control. He warned Victoria that when Claire's mask slipped, she would see what he had seen, a dangerous brilliance, an instinct to exploit trust, a mind too sharp to underestimate. His final line was both plea and warning. Protect yourself when love becomes a weapon. Truth is your only defense. Victoria's hands trembled as she read. The walls of her world seemed to close in each word, pressing harder against her chest. She tried to breathe, but the air had turned heavy and thin. For so long she had tried to build a bridge to Claire, inviting her into the Newman circle, defending her when others doubted, calling her daughter with pride and pain interwoven. But now, as the truth sank in, she realized she had been protecting the wrong person. The woman living under her roof, wearing the face of her child, was not her flesh and blood. She was something else, an intruder who had taken advantage of grief to step into a life that was never hers. The shock hit like an electric current. Victoria's vision blurred. Her knees gave way, and before she could even call for help, darkness rushed in. When she awoke hours later, the letter lay crumpled in her hand, its creases like scars across the paper. She stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had seen. How could she reconcile the girl she had held in her arms with the stranger described in Cole's confession? Every smile, every word, every shared moment now felt like an echo of deceit. She wanted to scream, to destroy the letter, to erase the truth, but denial offered no comfort. Deep down she knew the truth didn't lie. Claire wasn't her daughter. Meanwhile, Claire continued to move through Genoa City's orbit with effortless charm to those around her. He seemed lighter than ever, unbothered by the whispers that had begun to trail behind her. She dined with Holden, teasing him about his cautious nature. She laughed with Sienna over wine, pretending not to notice the flicker of doubt that passed through the other woman's eyes. And when Matt appeared, she greeted him not as a villain from her family's history, but as an equal. The three of them, Holden, Sienna and Matt, became her stage, her audience, her mirror. The more she controlled their perception, the more powerful she felt. But beneath her flawless composure, something was shifting. There were moments when her reflection in the mirror seemed to waver, as if the face she wore was trying to peel away. She could hear Cole's voice, sometimes faint but insistent, the ghost of the man who had known her too well. Truth always finds you no matter how far you run. She would shake it off, telling herself that truth was only dangerous to the weak, and she was no longer weak when word of Victoria's collapse spread. Claire's reaction was strangely detached. She visited briefly, her expression appropriately concerned, but her eyes betrayed nothing. Those who didn't know better would have mistaken her calm for strength. Those who did would have recognized it as indifference. As she stood by Victoria's bedside, watching the woman who had once called her daughter tremble beneath the weight of betrayal, a faint smile ghosted across Claire's lips, one that disappeared before anyone could name it outside. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the same question that haunted everyone who had ever crossed paths with the Newman family. Who was Claire really, and what did she want? The answer, when it came, would unravel more than family ties. It would expose a legacy built on deception and a woman who understood that love, once weaponized, could destroy more completely than hatred ever could. Victoria had always believed that the truth announces itself with thunder, some dramatic crack in the sky, some cosmic acknowledgement that a life is about to split into before and after. But when the truth about Claire arrived, it came as a thin envelope and an ordinary afternoon hush, the kind of quiet that tricks you into thinking you still have time. She had already been uneasy for days, haunted by scenes in Claire's story that didn't match the fabric of memory, small contradictions that might have been nothing in any other town, but in Genoa City. When she slit the flap and unfolded Cole's last instructions, half testament, half confession, her name stood there with the weight of a verdict, not a calculation about shares or properties, not a sentimental farewell wrapped in phrases about destiny, but a ledger of facts that stripped sentiment to the bone. The girl you have led into your house, your heart, your lineage, is not who she says she is. The paper trail that reassured you was doctored. The dates you clutched were chosen for what they hid, not what they revealed. Love has been treated as an instrument, grief as a solvent. Cole's prose was clinical, almost painfully restrained, as if he knew that any flourish would be a kind of mercy, and he no longer believed in mercies. He explained what he had traced and why he had waited, afraid he would not be believed, afraid that confirming an ugly suspicion would end whatever delicate peace Victoria had managed to construct from the ruins of other losses. Protect yourself. He had written, when love becomes a weapon, truth is your only defense. She read the line twice and then again, as if repetition might change the meaning. It didn't. Her chest tightened with an old ache she recognized and hated. The moment grief turns into heat, the exact second denial runs out of oxygen, the room tilted. She gripped the edge of the console table, closed her eyes and saw the last few months collapse into a single image, Claire's poised smile, Claire's considerate hands tidying the already tidy. Claire's outward serenity that somehow made everyone else feel noisy, messy, too much. The next breath wouldn't come. The floor rose like a tide, then stopped. Darkness didn't so much descend as dim the edges. And she knew later that she hadn't fainted because she was fragile. She fainted because her body was quicker than her mind at understanding the price of the truth it had just accepted. When she stood again, the world was altered, but not yet broken. Rage arrived after the stillness, not as a scream, but as a steadiness and new mathematics that solved to only one answer: the masquerade ends now. She did not rehearse. She did not plan cutting lines. She walked through the house with the letter folded once and pressed into her palm like a stone she could not drop. She found Claire in the front room, sunlight flattering the polished surfaces, the kind of setting that makes even conversations look civilized. Claire turned with that unhurried grace that had charmed so many people into mistaking it for goodness, and for a fraction of a second Victoria almost faltered, because the illusion was that complete, that face, that posture, the familiarity of presence that makes the brain whisper daughter, even as the evidence screams fraud. But this was not about what was easy. This was about what was true. She did not ask a question she already knew the answer to. She did not bait or beg. She laid the paper on the table between them, anchored by her hand like a signature that could not be forged, and she said what people remember as a tearing, even though it was delivered with precision. This is who you are not. This is how you came here. This is why you chose me. This is where the lies begin and where they end. If Claire's composure cracked, it did so invisibly. The eyes widened and then narrowed, a microclimate of emotion that moved so fast it could be mistaken for nothing. Surprise arrived too quickly to be genuine, indignation too clean to be unplanned, fear too shallow to be real. What came next was not contrition but contempt. She mocked the premise that love required proof. She scoffed at the arrogance of bloodlines as guarantees of worth. And when contempt hardened, she reached for cruelty, because cruelty, unlike apology, does not risk intimacy. She provoked, she taunted. She chose words designed to scorch the tenderest parts of memory and hit them without flinching. In another house, in another story, Victoria would have shouted. Instead, she allowed the silence to do the work of judgment. There are sentences so ugly they do not echo. They just hang in the air like smoke that stings even after it clears. In that smoke, the last possibility of forgiveness burned to ash. Victoria saw, then, what Cole had seen, not the villain out of a melodrama, but the colder danger of a learned performance, someone who had decided long ago that belonging is a game of angles and masks, that the only sin is losing the room. Outside, a wind moved through the trees with that autumn insistence that abrades even well-kept lawns into something honest. Inside, Victoria gave shape to a boundary. The masquerade was over, the house would be cleared of this invented narrative, the family would be warned, and whatever compassion remained would be expressed as distance, not embrace. Claire tried to goad one last time, the kind of raised voice that demands spectacle, that wants the neighbors to hear in the story to metastasize, but spectacle has less power in the face of dignity than people who live on spectacle believe. The scene ended without the scene Claire tried to stage. When the door closed behind her, the quiet felt like something returned, not something lost across town. Destiny kept a different kind of appointment. The hospital had that late afternoon pallor, the light thinner, the sounds duller, the fatigue in the corridors settling like dust. Sharon had fallen into a ritual of watchfulness that no one teaches, but every mother learns by instinct, counting breaths, reading the minuscule shifts of a resting face, telling stories soft enough that memory can approach without fear. She had finally stopped asking the machines for permission to hope. Hope had moved in stubborn and plain, refusing the drama of either slash or in favor of the daily work of if. She was there when Noah's fingers twitched not once, but decisively, and she was there when his eyelids flickered in that confusing interval between dream and return. Everything that came next felt like the answer to a prayer that had been clawed raw by doubt and still somehow persisted. The eyes opening, not in the first fog glance locating her outline, the focus sharpening on what the body knows before the mind remembers. The single word was not a speech, not a revelation, but it resounded through the room with cathedral gravity. Mother. She did not weep right away because joy sometimes has to pass through disbelief before it can flood. But when it flooded, it was clean. The doctor's face, practiced in restraint, could not keep all of his relief hidden, and the language was the precise optimism medicine allows itself when it refuses to tempt fate. Stable vitals, appropriate response, no acute distress, a trajectory that suggests forward, not back. Sharon learned these phrases months ago. Once thought of them as evasions and now received them as benedictions. She touched Noah's hair the way she had when he was a boy waking from fevers after long nights, a gesture that always meant you are still here and so am I. When Nikki and Victoria arrived, summoned by the text Sharon had typed with fingers that could finally stop trembling, the small circle around the bed became the kind of tableau families make without design. A chair pulled close. Closer than decorum allows, a hand on the rail just to feel the cold metal that also means safety, the hush that falls, not because anyone instructs it but because reverence is contagious. Noah tried to place his own life as if it were a set of photographs shuffled and reassembled out of order. Faces came easier than sequences. He knew who loved him and whom he loved. He knew his own name the way you know a rhythm. You can hum even when you cannot recall the first lyric. But when he reached for the accident, memory withdrew like a tide. There was the suggestion of speed, the smear of light, the awful intimacy of fear without object, and then nothing usable. He frowned not out of frustration with himself, but in determination, the way he had frowned as a boy when a puzzle might yield if he did not look away. He remembered the city moving under him like a living thing. He remembered laughter with someone whose voice kept shape but not a face. And he remembered a silence that had felt imposed, not chosen. He looked at Victoria and Nikki with that combination of apology and demand that belongs to patients who wake into a story already in progress. He wanted context, not comfort. Why am I here? Is a question about facts. Why did this happen? Is a question about the world. He asked the first, the second would wait. Sharon answered, as far as a mother can answer without poisoning, the water a son must drink to heal. She emphasized safety before hazard, trajectory before trauma. There had been an incident. He had been hurt. He had been brave even while unconscious, because sometimes survival is a kind of bravery. He was not alone anymore and would not be again. The doctor invited into the cadence of reassurance, knitted medical detail into maternal narrative, translating risk into regimen and prognosis into process. Victoria stood at the foot of the bed, hands steady, voice quiet, offering not information but presence. She would later decide that this hour, the one in which she said nothing about Claire, nothing about the letter, was not an evasion, but a choice to let one mercy exist uncorrupted by any other necessity. Nikki, whose faith has weathered more storms than she cares to count, did what faith knows how to do. She sat. She did not fill the room with exhortations or aphorisms. She occupied it with steadiness. The renewal of consciousness has its own bureaucracies. Forms multiply when the mind reappears, evaluations, pain scales, little tests of orientation that make the world seem like the answer key to a quiz you didn't mean to take. Noah passed the first gate easily. He remembered birthdays out of order, but accurately he located himself in a month, if not a date. He could count backward by sevens until he laughed and said the math was boring, even if he could finish it when the conversation drifted inexorably back to the blank place where the accident should be. He did not flinch. He accepted the blank as a fact, not a failure, and then did the thing that more than any other told Sharon he was still himself. He asked to be brought the threads he could weave. Later, tell me enough, he said, without the drama of the question. Do not tell me so much that I drown. The news moved quickly because good news moves faster than bad. When a family has been starved of it, Sharon stepped into the hallway long enough to send a single message to Nick that needed no embellishment. He is awake. She could have added that the color was back in Noah's face, that the pulse no longer felt like a skittish animal, that the room itself seemed to be breathing easier. She did not need to. A father's body recognizes the call to return in a frequency other instruments cannot measure. Somewhere across town, in a plan half-formed and too hot, Nick had been negotiating with his own rage, choosing routes through the night that led toward the shadow room, rehearsing confrontations with Mitch that would convert suspicion into evidence, telling himself that justice is merely patience with a spine. The phone shocked him with a recalibration. He did not forget Matt and he did not forgive him. He did, however, change direction. A man may carry two wars at once, but only one deserves his presence in the first hour after his son's first word. By the time Nick reached the room, the energy inside had changed in ways only the closest notice when a person returns from the kind of dark that doesn't bruise the skin. Everyone's posture shifts, even the flowers seem to stand taller. Nick took one look and understood that this moment did not belong to fury. He let his hand rest on the rail, not as a sentinel but as a father, acknowledging a boundary. The body heals on its own timeline. Vengeance obeys no timeline at all, and if he confused the two he would lose both. He greeted his son with the economy of someone who has wasted too many words on wrong priorities, and he greeted Sharon like an ally whose patience had outlasted his rage. They did not pretend the past few weeks had been gentle or that their disagreements had been small. They did not litigate motives. They stood where love instructs even proud people to stand, in the surrender that says whatever we are to each other, we are first and last. The parents of this person in the hours that followed, Noah's questions were exactly as simple and exactly as devastating as the staff predicted. He wanted to know where the pain came from and how long it might stay. The physician answered without poetry, but with the kind of quiet that earns trust.